Hi, this is Steve Florison. This is Unit 20, Analyse the Impacts of Sociological Factors on Clients, and in our context, the clients are students. We're going to be looking more generally at the situation in Australia. There's one assessment for this unit, it's 20.1, and it's a series of written questions. The practical component for the assessment of this unit is included in 18.2, which is a combined practical assessment. So let's have a look at the political structure in Australia. It's a unique democracy. It's underpinned by four beliefs: the belief in the rule of law, human rights, and civil liberties. It's a bit like the British and North American models, but it is still unique. It is quite different to anything else in the world. The Commonwealth of Australia was created on January the 1st, 1901, which is Federation Day, and this is when 6 former British colonies, all like small countries, all in their own right, agreed to form a union or a federation together. The political structure in Australia has the legislative branch, which contains a parliament, and this is a body that makes the laws, the executive branch, and they administer the laws made by the legislative branch, and then the judicial branch of government. And this allows for the establishment of the country's courts, the appointment of judges, etc. And they also interpret laws. The structure has 2 chambers, the House of Representatives, which is the lower house, and the Senate, the upper house. Both are responsible for national laws, such as those, trade, taxation, etc. The legislation has to be approved by both houses before it can become law. And that's a safety mechanism. It can sometimes be frustrating for governments because it's hard to get laws or changes through. The House of Representatives initiates most legislation. It has 150 elected members, each representing about 80,000 voters. And the political party, or the combination of political parties with the most seats, forms the government. The Senate is known as a House of Review, and proposed laws are considered clause by clause and often referred off to subcommittees. One of the Senate's original roles was to ensure that laws were fair to all states, small states and big states. So there are 12 senators from each state and 2 senators from each of Australia's 2 territories. So that means if you're a small state like Tasmania, you have the same number of senators as a large state like New South Wales, where there are a lot of people. So if you look at how you are represented in the Commonwealth Parliament, you are represented by 1 House of Representatives person, and if you live in a state, then you're also represented by 12 senators. Or if you live in a territory, like the Northern Territory, you're represented by 2 senators. So people in the Northern Territory are represented by 3 people in the Commonwealth Parliament. I come from Western Australia, a state. I'm represented by 12 senators, 1 House of Representative person, which is 13 people. A lot of representation. We also have 2 other tiers of government. So we have the Commonwealth government and then state and territory governments, and then we have local governments or shires as well. So we have these 3 tiers. The economic structure in Australia is capitalism. That picture is not Australia, that's the Alsace region of France, very nice area. Capitalism, what is it? It's an economic system where there's private or corporate ownership of assets, and where investors are free to buy, sell, etc. Central to this whole idea is that you gather or create wealth through accumulating capital, and then you use that capital to achieve a certain lifestyle. When we look at the history of the economic structure in Australia, post-war there was very significant expansion in agriculture and mining, and there was a lot of immigration to meet those labour needs in mining and agriculture. In 1980, we saw financial deregulation, and this continued into the 90s, and it basically meant that we joined the rest of the world as a financial player, and this has benefits to us. It also means that we can be affected quite seriously by something which happens in another country and which we haven't contributed to in any way at all, such as a global financial crisis. So we saw the floating of the dollar in the 80s and 90s, and we had a recession, and then now we've seen the mining boom start to slow down and even retract, and this really affect states like Western Australia and Queensland, where there's significant mining. So the current situation is that there's still significant opportunity to access assets and have a standard of living, but some people have advantages and are more able to access more of the Australian economy. Other people are disadvantaged for a whole range of reasons, and these people have limited access to the economic rewards that come from being a part of Australia. So it's not an even playing field. So when I first looked at this, I thought, social and cultural institutions, what on earth are they? And they're a little bit hard to wrap your head around, but they're stable, valued, recurring patterns of behaviour. They're like structures in society. So they're what we call social and cultural institutions, and they're things like the church, the political system, the legal system, education, family, all of those sort of things, the media, all of those are social and cultural institutions. In Australia, a lot of policies have been built around the fact that the family is a unit, such as a man, a woman and children, and examples of child benefits, education and child care. Over recent years, there's been a lot of changes in Australia in how the family is structured, with a decrease in the traditional family to include more de facto parents, single parent families and same-sex parents. For some of these families, such as single mothers, there's going to be financial disadvantages. While they might receive Australian benefits, it's more difficult to achieve full-time work. Talking about work, access to well-paid full-time employment is almost a prerequisite to being able to enjoy the rewards of the Australian economic system. If you can't get well-paid or reasonably well-paid full-time employment, then how do you achieve the sort of assets to have the lifestyle that you want? It's very hard. And things like superannuation, healthcare, sickness and accident benefits are often a product of well-paid full-time employment. So people who don't fit this model are people who are unemployed, people who rely on part-time work, which is a lot more people these days, and people who rely on low-paid employment. Australia, like other countries, discriminates against non-citizens, and they've got residence rules for particular benefits or services. So things like healthcare and that's for Australians basically, and people who are recent immigrants, visitors to the country, they can't access the same services as people who live here, people who are citizens. Social policies, this is a study of actions and decisions of government that contribute to the well-being of the population. It involves areas such as social security, welfare, disability, health, education, employment, all of those sort of things. The study of social policy is particularly interested in understanding the values and ideas that underpin this policy. And so question 9 is, how could social policy impose inequality on Australians or communities of Australians? And so if you think about this in terms of different groups in Australia, it might be Indigenous groups, it might be people who are unemployed, it might be people who have some sort of disability. Do we have policies? Are you aware of any policies that impose inequality? And I'm sure you can think of some. I want to look a little at the history of social policy in Australia. Historically, social welfare commenced in 1908 with legislation establishing the old age pension, and that's pretty interesting to me. That's that's fairly forward thinking for a small country. 8 years out from federation, and they've established the old age pension and are paying it in 1909. When we look at social policy in Australia, it's very different from other countries, and I think we should be very grateful to live in a country like Australia. It's proved to be remarkably resilient since its inception, and Australian social welfare does tend to be confined to Australian citizens, as we've already said. Remember we said that in 1909 we first got the old age pension. In 1910 the invalid pension became available, and in 1912 maternity allowance was introduced, and this was a fixed amount payable to a mother on the birth of each child. And it's been called lots of different things over the years. We still have it today, and that's pretty amazing when you think that that came in 1912. I want to look a little at recent governments, and I want to start with Gough Whitlam's government in the early 70s, because everything changed with Gough Whitlam. Everything, I mean, in terms of social policy, there were dramatic changes, and a lot of Australians were quite unhappy about this because they felt all of these changes were being imposed and they didn't agree with them, and so there was a lot of backlash, a lot of unhappiness, but they were very major changes. So Gough Whitlam was the leader of the Labor Party in 1972 to 1975 in government, and this government was a watershed in social policy history, and for these reasons we suddenly had Aboriginal land rights, the Order of Australia, there was the abolition of the gerrymander favouring rural voters. Now what that means is that in the House of Representatives there was a system where a small number of people could elect a House of Representative politician, and that's what they call the gerrymander. So today it's much more even, with about 80,000 people electing each one of those politicians. We got Medibank and an expanded role, federal role, in schools, universities, roads, the arts and the environment. So you can see there were massive changes. There was the Family Law Act to make divorce easier. Single mothers were allowed to claim welfare benefits. There were unemployment benefits, just $10 a week in 1972. That was the unemployment benefit. How could you live on that? They were lifted to the pension level, which itself was raised substantially. Women were guaranteed equal pay for equal work. The government actively took up a feminist agenda. Homosexuality was no longer a crime. The government built the National Gallery. They spent $1.1 million buying Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, and I was a child at the time, and I can remember that. That was a massive controversy. I was a teenager, actually. But today it's worth significantly more than that, so it has been a reasonable investment. The Australia Council was established to fund artists, and the Australian Film Commission was established. So after Gough Whitlam, we had Malcolm Fraser, and you'll remember that the government of Gough Whitlam was effectively stopped, and by the Governor General at the time. It was very controversial, and then we had Malcolm Fraser, and many people thought that Malcolm Fraser would overturn or reverse a lot of these social changes, but he didn't. He maintained nearly all of them. And he went on to do more social reform himself. He established the Human Rights Commission, gave effect to 5 international human rights instruments. He started the Commonwealth Ombudsman in 1977. He introduced Australia's first freedom of information laws. And then Bob Hawke came along. So we've gone Labor, Gough Whitlam, Liberal, Malcolm Fraser, now Labor, Bob Hawke again. He put active society measures were introduced in an attempt to limit the growth of poverty and inequality. And Australia really does appear to have become a more equal society when that was measured over that period, 81 to 94. So that includes the part of the Keating years. So there was massive social and economic change during this period of time. There was income support payments and services such as education, health, public housing and childcare. There was a progressive nature to the income tax system, so that people earning more paid more. And we had Paul Keating. He tried to establish his reconciliation with Australia's Indigenous population. He worked towards that, furthered economic ties with Asia, established the Australian National Training Authority, the Creative Nation Scheme, reviewed the Sex Discrimination Act, and native title rights for Australia's Indigenous people were implemented following this historic Mabo High Court decision. And then along came John Howard, and he was in government for a long time, 1996 to 2007. He promoted the traditional family. He was opposed to the promotion of multiculturalism at the expense of a shared Australian identity. It's an interesting concept, that. So he was an interesting man in that he was the Liberal Party's first pro-market leader in a Conservative coalition. So he was an economical radical and a social conservative. He negotiated a motion of reconciliation. He amended Australia's superannuation laws to allow same-sex couples to inherit their partner's private sector superannuation, and he established its definition of marriage, the union of a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others, into the Marriage Act. So he made significant changes as well. So all of these prime ministers with their governments made fairly significant changes to Australia's social fabric. And along comes Kevin Rudd. So Kevin Rudd was in there from 2007 to 2010. He initiated the apology to Aboriginal Australians. He's very well known and respected for doing that. He implemented the funding of Indigenous outstations housing. There was greater recognition of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender rights in Australia. There were reforms to the recognition of same-sex relationship in taxation, health, employment, superannuation, and in aged care and other areas. So his government made contributions as well. Julia Gillard came along in 2010, toppled Mr Rudd, introduced the Clean Energy Bill, modified asylum seeker policy, introduced a mineral resource rent tax, implemented the National Broadband Network, increased school funding following the Gonski Review, and introduced the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And that was a very significant contribution that Julia Gillard's government made, that last one, because we find that Kevin Rudd came back in for a short period of time, and then we went to the Tony Abbott government. So much of Julia Gillard's social reform was overturned by the following government. So most of that was overturned or significantly changed by the Abbott government. This is what Abbott said. He said, Tony Abbott, he said, the government spending on a range of social programs, including education, health, housing, etc., has reached extraordinary levels, but there's an inadequate level of revenue, and it's forced the nation into indebtedness that in an age of slowing growth and ageing population simply unsustainable. So all of those reforms that occurred cost Australia a lot of money. What he's saying now is we can't afford it anymore. And so it's interesting that the Howard government, 1996 to 2007, and the Rudd government delivered about $169 billion worth of income tax cuts. So one of their first options would have been to increase the tax take, but instead they cut a whole range of social programs. And a Treasury analysis after their first budget, some months after the first budget, said the proposed spending cuts would cost an average of $842 for lower income households. Middle income would be down $477, and very high income families would lose just $71. So it was a very unfair budget, and you know, when people look back and analyse it now, it was quite unfair. So what does affect social policy in Australia? And again, this is not a picture of Australia, but a picture of the Alsace region of France, wine growing area. The example of social policy changes in Australia from Whitlam right through to Turnbull or to Abbott clearly show that the government of the day drives the change. So it's the government of the day drive the change. It's also pretty clear in Australia that Labor governments have focused on policy change, and Liberal or coalition governments have focused on, you know, financial issues, ensuring that the country is in good shape financially. But there have been exceptions to that on both sides, significant exceptions to it on both sides, and today the parties are much more similar than they have been in the past. So what is it that influences government to change social policy? It could be, as we've just mentioned, a particular social agenda, like the ALP, the Greens, etc. Have a focus on social agenda. It could be what is developing practice in other countries. It could be lobbying from special interest groups, lobbying from peak bodies, lobbying from institutions such as the church, the results of opinion polls, and we've seen that the government of Australia has been very much driven by this in the last 10 or so years. It could be individuals or community groups making representation. It could be individual incidents, such as the Port Arthur massacre or the 9/11 attack. All of those individual influences can change social policy. Or it could be a personal event or experience in the lives of politicians or leaders. And we saw that, I think, with Bob Hawke's daughter having some sort of drug issue, and that influenced social policy to an extent. So there's lots of triggers for changing social policy, and you can see that you as a citizen of Australia, you can have an influence on this as well. You can make representation, you can try and affect social policy yourself. Turnbull said that it's vitally important as a matter of social justice and political reality that any changes are seen as being fair across the board. That means not only must tough decisions be justified, but that the burden of the adjustment is not borne disproportionately by one part of the community, as it was in that first budget of the Abbott government. So when we look at social issues in Australia, we see that lots of policies are built around the idea of family as a man, woman and children. We are changing from that. Several factors have contributed to that trend. These include an ageing population, the delay in having children, and that's very often economically driven, the increase of single parents, the growth of alternative models such as same-sex parents, more couples deciding not to have children, and the increased tendencies for households to be split because of divorce or de facto breakup. And so you can see that, and you probably know from your own experience that when families do break up, it has a fairly significant impact on the finances of each of those parties, as well as lots of other social impacts, particularly for the children. Single parents, social policies in the past have reinforced the traditional family by rewarding mainstream conduct and disadvantaging parents who are single parents. Rewards include subsidies for married dependents and so on and so forth. So being a single parent can often bring disadvantages. And another, oddly enough, is childbearing. And teenage motherhood was the norm in previous generations, but it's now much more common for women to delay childbearing. And the reasons for this include the effect of urban society on having children, the changing role of women, the economic effect of female employment, so that, leading to loss of income if they leave the workforce, and so on and so forth. And these images, by the way, are from a boarding house in the Black Forest in Germany. Beautiful boarding house. So here's another image from the same place. So another social issue in Australia is immigration, and some people that are newly arrived here don't have access to the same assets. It's interesting to think about class and status in Australia, isn't it? Because you've probably debated this. We've debated it. Do we have class? Probably most people would agree that it's an economic class structure in Australia. If you have a lot of wealth and assets, you seem to have a different position in Australian society. And so I'm not sure we have class the same as some other countries, but there's definitely difference in status in Australia. So we just want to look at some of the inequalities in Australia. There's gender inequality, and this is still around today. So, women do not have the same opportunities as men. Governments have been working on this. Society and institutions have been working on it. We're definitely seeing changes. Some people would say not enough change and not quickly enough. Race, of course, we're seeing people of different races, who are treated differently in Australia. Another inequality, of course, is employment. If you don't have employment, you can't really access all of the rewards of the Australian society. Another is age, and I just want to talk a little bit about age discrimination. The Age Discrimination Act covers situations that include where a person's refused employment on the basis of their age, where they're dismissed, denied a promotion, where they're given less favourable terms, where they're denied access to training, where they're selected for redundancy, where they're harassed. And so you're not allowed to do that. It's against that act if you treat people poorly. And there is a significant amount of age discrimination in employment in Australia still. What about the long-term unemployed? We know that long-term unemployment is associated with poor physical and mental health, and workers who remain outside the workforce for some time find it much harder to enter. The long-term unemployed also tend to earn less. Once they do find jobs, they tend to be in poorer health, have children with worse outcomes, and communities with a higher share of long-term unemployed workers also tend to have higher rates of crime and violence. So this is problematic, very problematic for a country to have large numbers of people who are unemployed. There's a study around at the moment that shows that if you are long-term unemployed, and that generally means for more than 1 year, it is almost impossible to get work. And there is a stigma attached to long-term unemployment, which means that employers are very unlikely to provide jobs. So we want to look now at how can we assist our students, with this material that we've just been through, how does that affect our students, how can we assist them? So there's going to be social and cultural issues that impact on all students to a greater or lesser extent, and they're going to be strongly positive and strongly negative. For some students, they will have been impacted in such a way that their experience at the school or the boarding residence is going to be compromised. And so this could be behavioural concerns, interpersonal and social concerns, physical health, including mental health, family issues, educational issues. Sometimes these outcomes may be causal. For example, with the long-term unemployed example that we talked about. And so we need to understand and be informed about those sort of causal issues. So we need to just be informed, to interview students, to interview parents and guardians, to get as much information as we can from previous schools, from previous health clinics, particularly students who come from remote communities, gain an understanding about those communities, that sort of thing. And then we need to take action. Now this needs to be within the scope of our role, so we need to make sure that what we're doing is within the scope of our role, it's within the organisation policy and procedure, and just being able to use available services in your residence or in the school that's attached to your residence, and available services in the area. And we need to try and make sure that the support was effective. So we need to monitor and measure it. And we can monitor it by just moving around and looking at how the students are interacting, or we might monitor it by paying particular attention to new students, cultural and linguistically different students, diverse students, students who are not engaging with activities, and students who are not communicating. So for me, in the boarding residence, they were always the red lights. So if we've got, they were the little flashing red light. Here's a student who's not engaging with any of the activities. Here's a student who's not engaging with any other students. So we need to find out what is the problem, what's the issue, and to be able to provide support to those students. And then, of course, to students who are not communicating, either with the staff or with other students. We need to be able to support those students as well. So how do we measure student satisfaction? And this is a boarding school in the Rift Valley in Africa. How do we measure student satisfaction? Student satisfaction tracking, and there'll be an attachment on site, on the website, so you can have a look at that. Student surveys, anecdotal records from observation, conversations, phone calls, etc. Parent complaints, student complaints, interviews. All of those are ways of measuring student satisfaction, and you as a boarding supervisor will get a bit of an understanding from the feel of the residents, how it's any tensions or anything like that in the residents, and you will be able to ascertain whether the students are satisfied, whether they're happy, whether they have issues, that sort of thing. Thank you very much.